You know that person who laughs at absolutely everything? The one who finds humor in situations that would send most people straight into a breakdown? Yeah, that's not an accident. And it's definitely not because life has been kind to them. Usually it's the opposite. I'm not talking about small inconveniences or awkward teenage years. I'm talking about the kind of experiences that quietly rewire your nervous system. The kind that teach you very early on that stability is temporary and safety is never guaranteed. Let me paint you a picture. Someone cuts them off in traffic. Most people feel anger spike immediately. Road rage, insults, heart racing. But them, they pause. Their mind jumps 3 steps ahead. Maybe that driver is having the worst day of their life. Maybe they're dealing with a breakup, a loss, a crisis you can't see. Or maybe they just really need to get somewhere fast. Because when you've survived real storms, other people's rain doesn't feel the same. Here's what nobody really explains about people who've been through too much. Their brain doesn't break. It adapts. It trains itself into a survival machine so efficient, it keeps running even when the danger is gone. Their nervous system learned one rule: stay alert, stay flexible, stay alive. And something strange happens when you live like that long enough. You stop being shocked by chaos, not immune to pain, but immune to being completely destroyed by it. They've already learned the worst-case scenarios. They've already lived through moments where things fell apart without warning. So when life throws something unexpected their way, their body doesn't panic the same way. It recognizes the pattern. And here's where people get it wrong. You'd expect someone who suffered deeply to be bitter, cynical, closed off. But more often than not, they're the most empathetic people in the room. Not performative empathy. Not surface-level kindness. Real, unsettling empathy. They can spot pain instantly. A slight hesitation in your voice. A smile that arrives half a second too late. A silence that lasts just a little longer than it should. They don't just hear what you say. They hear what you don't say. They understand silence the way others understand language. They know when it's heavy, when it's tired, when it's disappointed, when it's asking for help without knowing how. Most people walk into a room and notice the furniture. They walk in and feel the emotional temperature. They sense shifts in atmosphere the way others sense changes in weather. And they rarely talk about it because explaining it feels exhausting. But there's something quietly beautiful that grows out of all that pain. Psychologists call it post-traumatic growth. The idea that some people don't just recover from trauma. They transform because of it. Their priorities sharpen, their relationships deepen. Their tolerance for meaningless drama disappears completely. They start finding intense beauty in ordinary moments. A quiet morning, a safe conversation, a sunset that makes their chest feel strangely tight. They don't take peace lightly, because they know exactly how expensive chaos can be. But here's the part that doesn't get romanticized. Their nervous system never fully stands down. They become hyper-aware, hyper-prepared, always scanning, even when everything seems fine. They like sitting where they can see exits. They have backup plans for things that don't need backup plans. They rehearse conversations they may never have. Not because they're paranoid, because once upon a time, being unprepared cost them something. And that's where the contradiction begins. They're calm in real emergencies, but tense during moments that are supposed to be safe. They'll handle a crisis with terrifying composure, then spiral over something small and controllable. Because control, even in tiny doses, feels like relief. And maybe the most heartbreaking part of all this is how often they minimize their own experiences. It wasn't that bad. Other people had it worse. I'm fine. Really? They say it so convincingly they almost believe it. Not because it's true, but because surviving required them to believe it. And that mindset doesn't stop at how they move through the world. It follows them straight into their relationships. People who've been through too much often confuse others without meaning to. They can be incredibly loyal and incredibly distant at the same time. They'll show up for you at 3 in the morning without hesitation. No questions, no drama, no complaints. But ask them what they need. Ask them how they're really doing. Suddenly they're busy, distracted, fine, always fine. Because closeness for them has never been neutral. It's come with consequences. When early connections were unpredictable or unsafe, your nervous system doesn't relax when someone gets close. It braces. So they learn a strange skill. They become experts at being needed and amateurs at needing. They convince themselves they don't require support, that independence equals strength, that relying on someone else is dangerous, and it works until it doesn't, because beneath that armor is a very human desire to be seen without being hurt, to be understood without having to explain everything, to rest without feeling guilty for it. This is why so many of them master humor, especially dark humor. Not because they're insensitive, but because humor gives them control. When you can laugh at your own pain, it loses some of its power over you. Every joke becomes a small act of rebellion. A way of saying, you didn't win. They turn suffering into something manageable, something shareable, something that doesn't scare people away. But humor is still armor, and armor gets heavy after a while. There's another contradiction most people don't notice. People who've been through too much often crave control and surrender at the same time. They'll micromanage the smallest details of their life. The exact routine, the right cup, the right timing. And yet, when it comes to the big picture, they can be eerily calm. Career uncertainty, major life changes, things falling apart. They've already lived through collapse. They know the world doesn't end when plans do. So they obsess over what they can control and make peace with what they can't. They become walking paradoxes. Resilient, but tired. Hopeful, but guarded. Open-hearted, yet armored. They understand something most people don't learn until much later. That life can be beautiful and brutal at the same time, sometimes in the same moment. But underneath all that strength, there's a quieter grief that rarely gets named. It's not just grief for what happened. It's grief for who they were before it happened. They miss the version of themselves that trusted easily. The version that didn't scan rooms for danger. The version that laughed without checking how safe it was first. They grieve a softness they didn't get to keep. A lightness they didn't get to grow into slowly, and that kind of grief is hard to explain. How do you tell someone you miss a version of yourself you barely remember? How do you describe being homesick for a place that only existed inside your own mind? So they carry it quietly. They don't make it other people's problem. They fold it into who they've become, and that's why they value peace so deeply. Not excitement. Not chaos, peace. They choose safe people carefully. They protect calm like it's sacred. They walk away from anything that feels too familiar in the wrong way because they already know the cost. And maybe that's the real shift that happens when someone goes through too much. They stop chasing intensity. They start choosing stability. Not because they're afraid of life, but because they've lived enough of it to know what actually matters. There's a moment most people miss when they talk about those who've been through too much. They focus on survival, on resilience, on strength. But survival isn't the most interesting part. The most interesting part is what comes after. Because people like this don't just keep going. They change the way they understand being human. They stop believing in simple stories. Good versus bad. Strong versus weak. Happy versus broken. They know better. They've lived long enough inside contradiction to understand that you can be strong and exhausted at the same time. That you can love deeply and still keep distance. That you can hope without being naive. Their identity becomes layered. They are the people who don't panic when things fall apart, because they've already rebuilt themselves more times than they can count. They don't need life to be perfect. They need it to be honest. That's why they often feel out of sync with the world. Why small talk feels unbearable. Why superficial optimism irritates them. Why they get uncomfortable around people who have never had to question their own safety, their worth, or their place in the world. It's not arrogance, it's experience. They've seen what happens when illusions collapse, so they don't build their lives on them anymore. And here's the part that rarely gets acknowledged. People who've gone through too much often become emotional landmarks for others. Friends lean on them. Strangers open up to them without knowing why. People feel safe around them. Not because they have all the answers, but because they don't flinch at discomfort. They don't rush to fix pain, they sit with it. They've learned that some things don't need solutions, they need presence. This is where the metaphor fits. People like this are lighthouses. Not because they're perfect, not because they're untouched by storms, but because they've been standing in them for a long time. A lighthouse doesn't stop the waves. It doesn't calm the sea. It doesn't promise safety. It simply stays visible when everything else disappears. And the reason it shines is because it remembers the darkness. That's what people who've been through too much become. Quiet reference points. Living proof that chaos can be survived. That pain can be carried without being passed on. But being a lighthouse comes at a cost. You don't get to drift. You don't get to be careless. You don't get to forget. You stay alert. You stay grounded. You stay aware. And sometimes you wish you didn't have to. Sometimes you wish you could be softer, More spontaneous, less aware of how quickly things can change. But even that longing shapes you. It makes you intentional. It makes you selective. It makes you protective of what little peace you've earned. And that's the final truth most people never hear. People who've gone through too much aren't damaged. They're calibrated differently. Their pain didn't just hurt them. It taught them. It taught them what matters. Who matters? What isn't worth sacrificing themselves for anymore. Their survival became insight. Their insight became compassion. And their compassion became boundaries. So when you meet someone who seems a little too calm in chaos, a little too quick to laugh at things that shouldn't be funny, a little too comfortable with uncertainty, don't assume they're numb. Assume they've learned. They've learned how to stand in the storm without letting it define them. They've learned how to keep going without pretending it didn't hurt. They've learned how to be gentle in a world that wasn't. And if this felt uncomfortably familiar, if you recognized yourself somewhere in these words, then there's probably more about your inner world that deserves to be understood. Because this way of being doesn't stop here. It shapes how you think, how you love, how you detach, how you survive silence. And in the next video, we're going to explore another pattern that almost always follows people like this. One that explains why your mind never fully shuts off, why peace feels earned instead of given, and why you process the world in a way most people never will. That's where this story continues.